In this event, we will be discussing the implications of the COVID-19 health crisis on our economy. We will also have the time for questions at the end, which you can submit via the live chat. Our first guest, Mark Littlewood, he's the presenter of Live with Littlewood, a discussion program on the YouTube channel, and most famously, he's Director General of the IEA. We'll hopefully be joined by Will Hutton soon, who's a journalist and author, and he's notable for his books, The State We're In and How Good We Can Be. And they're both prominent commentators on the UK economy in the media. So first of all, Mark, would you like to start us off by talking about what you think the type of recovery we will expect from this economic crisis?
Well, it's pretty bleak, and I should say I and all of us at the IEA tend to be a bit sceptical about forecasts, right? So I don't want to sort of say to you, I'm pretty confident that GDP will grow by 9.73% next year. I'm not at all sure about that. And I think that the shape of the recovery cannot yet be predicted because it is highly dependent on a number of factors which are, well, at least to me, unknown and maybe unknowable. I mean, for example, if you are a pessimist and think that there is going to be a second peak of the virus and the need for another lockdown in the winter, well, that will be devastating. I think far worse than lockdown 1. And I think that's unknowable. I mean, if I had to guess, I'd say I don't expect there to be a second lockdown. Even if there is a second wave, I think we learned from wave 1 that we've got the health capacity to deal with it. That was the initial aim, to make sure that the NHS was not overwhelmed. That seems to have morphed into lockdown being sort of in place until we've actually beaten the virus. That's not just a switch of goalposts, that's a switch of the entire sport, I would argue. But I don't know whether there'll be a further lockdown. I suspect not. If there was, as I say, I think that would be more that would have a more degrading effect on the economy than the first, because I think the Institute for Fiscal Studies are right on this. You can kind of put the economy in the deep freeze for, I don't know, say a week without any damage at all. You can probably put it in the deep freeze for a month with some damage. By the time you've put it into the deep freeze for 3 months, 4 months, or 2 sets of 3 months, you're really causing long-term damage to the economic fibre and infrastructure of the country. So if you like, each day of lockdown or semi-lockdown is more painful than the previous one economically. And the second thing that we don't know, although I'm sure we'll get on to speculating about some of this, is what's the policy framework that's going to be brought in by the government. I don't yet know whether the upcoming budget will have in it tax cuts, for example, which would be the sort of thing I would advocate to get the economy going. I think there is the opportunity for a lot of deregulation and supply side reform, but I'm not saying that the government will embrace that reform. We've seen some moves on planning reform, for example, but not sufficiently radical for my taste. So I think predicting whether it's going to be a V, a U, or an L is premature. Too early to say, as Mao Zedong said about the French Revolution, still too early to say. And dependent really on those two big factors. Is there going to be a second wave and a lockdown? And what will the government's policy response be? I'm fairly optimistic that there won't be a further lockdown. I think balance of probabilities is against that. I'm about middling on whether I think the government's response is going to be sensible or stupid. But I think we should be able to make up some of the lost ground relatively quickly. But I'm not expecting, with the present policy framework, us to return to long-term growth rates of 3 or 4% that we've been historically used to. We might be able to make up the lost ground, but that shouldn't, in my view, be the height of our ambition. A more ambitious project would be asking the question, once we've made up that lost ground, what can we do to actually bring back long-term growth rates of, let's be optimistic, 3 or 4% rather than 1.5%, and we're miles away from that. So a cautious pessimism on my part, I would say.
Thank you very much.
On that, maybe you mentioned that lockdown is very bad for the economy. So should we have ended the lockdown sooner, or did we enter too fast? Is that what you're implying?
I think we should have. I think those are two very different questions, and I have different answers to them. I think a case can be made that we actually entered lockdown a little late, and we perhaps should have acted somewhat earlier. But you know, hindsight is 20/20 vision. What I think we got wrong was as data came in, and I feel for politicians who are having to operate in with a great deal of scientific uncertainty. Everybody says, let's follow the science, but the science was contestable. Scientists disagreed. We didn't know what the fatality rate of this virus was, for example. I mean, some extreme pessimistic views was a fatality rate of about 3%. Turns out the fatality rate's considerably less than 1%, I think. But we didn't know at the time of the lockdown the scale of the problem, and you could take kind of cautious prudential view that therefore the prudential thing to do was to lock down. However, we fairly quickly established that there was an enormous difference in the demographics who were affected by this virus. It's a sweeping generalization, but not a complete mistruth to say, if you're fit and healthy and under the age of 50, you have nothing to worry about. That's a slightly flippant way of putting it, because obviously some people under the age of 50 have died, and a good number of people under the age of 50 have got ill. But by and large, for that demographic, everybody under the age of 50 without any serious underlying health conditions, this is seasonal flu. And we don't lock down the economy every year when there's a bout of seasonal flu. So I would have preferred the lockdown to have very swiftly moved to being guidance rather than it being legal and mandatory. I think that might well have meant that, let's say, you know, people in their 70s or 80s would have sensibly chosen to have stayed at home. It seems to me that it was unnecessarily economically damaging and unnecessarily over-concerned about the health risks, which are real, but I think it was an overreaction to health risks to not allow people in their 20s, 30s and 40s to return to work much, much earlier. The risks to that demographic were low. So I think the blanket lockdown being in place for the length of time it was on balance an overreaction. As the data came in and we learned more about fatality rates and which groups were affected, we could have had a much, much more targeted approach, largely on older people.
Okay, so now onto the government's response and the furlough scheme. So obviously the government has never done anything like this, pay 80% of workers' wages before. Do you think that 80% is too generous compared to what other countries have done?
Yeah, I probably do. But I'm a fiscal hawk, basically. You know, I'm usually a skeptic about government spending. But even with my free market kind of fiscal hawk hat on, I'd say I've got some sympathy with what they were attempting to do. Some sympathy. I think it was somewhat on the overgenerous side, but I can see the case for a furlough scheme, because the economic case was as follows: that because of a mandated government lockdown, a substantial number of businesses that were otherwise wholly healthy and viable would have, over the short term, simply run out of cash and become unviable and gone to the wall. And if you could provide a bridge to get them from the start of lockdown to the end of lockdown, somehow see them over that period of very limited economic activity. If you're running a pub, you know, obviously your income has collapsed, almost to zero. I know there's been some entrepreneurial efforts to convert restaurants into takeaways and pubs, serving takeaway beer, but obviously a disaster, even for companies in the hospitality sector and numerous other sectors that would normally be viable. So I can see the case to say the government is preventing you from going about your ordinary business. You would be wholly viable if it wasn't for COVID-19 and the lockdown. So for a short period of time, we're going to see you through it. Where my concern with the furlough scheme is heightened is I think that probably should have been in place for what, in my view, should have been a shorter lockdown, so maybe for 4 weeks or 6 weeks. Stretching it out to October, I think that is now beginning to be subsidising unviable companies. That's gone a bit beyond a bridge to get you through the immediate lockdown period. I mean, by October, you would, I think, either have gone to the wall, and it's not the job of governments, in my view, to prop up companies that would go to the wall, or you would have returned to your normal operating business. I mean, by October, I think everybody should be able to return to normal income streams, and that's been further exacerbated by this announcement by the Chancellor yesterday that every company will be given a £1,000 bonus for each and every furloughed worker who's still on the payroll in January. And it seems to me that that's almost a mirror image of what we did to try and flatten the virus. We're almost trying to pretend that we can avoid a recession hitting at some point. I think there's a case for helping people get over the first few weeks of, I say, the sort of bridging loan, as it were, and I think I would have preferred it to be a loan than a grant. But we are potentially sort of kicking the can down the road and trying to pretend that government intervention can stop business closures and job losses, and it can't. So really your choice is, do you want to bring that on now, get it over with, reallocate human and capital resources efficiently, or do we want to keep companies, which frankly are probably going to go to the wall eventually, alive in October and potentially in January, and then face this problem next February, next March, because the problem is coming. So by and large, I think the furlough scheme has now become a delaying tactic rather than a sensible economic instrument to support otherwise viable companies.
Isn't a big part of the furlough scheme also retaining the value of the matches between employers and employees? So isn't this the difference between the European and the US model? So a key question is, how fast can the economy reallocate unemployed workers if you don't maintain these matches?
Well, that's exactly right. Yes, of course. I mean, even with the relatively flexible British labour market, I mean, I would like it to be enormously more flexible, but by Western European standards, it's a pretty flexible labour market. If you suddenly dump 5 million people onto the unemployment line, they're not immediately by the next morning all going to find new jobs. Clearly, that's not the case. But I think we have to accept that the reality is that there is going to be a major shift in our economy. A very large number of legacy businesses are not going to be viable. So at some point, we've got to tackle this reallocation of labour. And I appreciate it's a devilishly difficult equation to sort of work out whether you're propping up a company that, if you like, should go to the wall, or whether you're providing short-term support for a company that will spring back into health. That's a very, very difficult judgment to make. But we are definitely going to be facing the conundrum of attempting to reallocate a very, very sizable part of the labour market. We don't need to do that all at once, tomorrow, but that is going to be a challenge over the next 12 months. I think that alongside some furlough scheme, possibly instead of some furlough scheme, the better way to approach that would have been to find employment law reforms that would make that reallocation easier, making it easier for a new company or a startup company or a company that's come out of the crisis well, I don't know, Zoom, for example, to take on new workers who are being displaced elsewhere. And none of that's really happened. So there's a danger that the furlough scheme sort of calcifies the economy rather than engaging in a measured process of creative destruction, which is what capitalism is good at. So I'm not a complete nihilist on the question of the furlough scheme. I'm not saying that there shouldn't have been any support, but I think that we have overlooked the problem, the dilemma that we have in companies that are going to grow, bounce back, perhaps companies that haven't been invented yet, but that will be invented in 2021. How are we making it easier for them to pick up displaced workers and employ them? And I think we're not making it sufficiently easy. Let me give you one example. I don't have the exact percentage in my head here, but the proportion of jobs in the UK that require an occupational license, you need a permit to be able to practice it, lawyer, for example. You might well think that you probably should have a permit if you want to practice as a brain surgeon, but you probably don't need a permit if you're going to practice as, say, an estate agent or a hairdresser. And we have a higher proportion of the labour force requiring some form of occupational licensing than even in France. So I think a fairly sensible measure would have been to actually say we're going to make it easier for people who were barmaids to become hairdressers, or people who were waiters to become estate agents, and vice versa. So we haven't really seen any sufficient regulatory reform, in my view, to prepare ourselves for what is going to have to be a major turnover in the labour market, and we're not sufficiently geared up to tackle that challenge. And using this sort of furlough scheme to sort of try and stop every last company going bust and try and stop any job being extinguished, in my view, is in some considerable way tackling the problem down the wrong end of the table.
On a different note, how about creative destruction? Will there be teleworking permanently? Will productivity actually increase long term?
That's possible. There's an interesting study or piece of research that I was referred to yesterday, only anecdotally, so I can't give you a link to this research. But the research suggested that actually a large amount of innovation, if you like, on the stocks, but it actually requires a crisis for it to be embraced. And the particular study here was from a good number of years ago. There was a partial tube strike in London. So various stations were shut down and you couldn't get the tube from your local station to work that day. And people had to find different means of going about their travel arrangements to the shop to work or whatever. But apart from that being a temporary displacement and it snapping back, in just the couple of weeks, I think it was, that tube strike was on, people discovered much more efficient ways of commuting and started scratching. They said, why was I ever taking the tube? This bus route is far better, or it's actually much, much better for me to walk to that tube station and get that line. And the change actually became permanent, even though there was no reason pre the strike why they couldn't have used the new routes that they discovered because of the strike. And I think that's very similar to what's happened to us in the crisis. There's no particular reason why you guys at the Marshall Society or me at the IEA couldn't have been running Zoom webinars and conferences 5 or 6 months ago. Right? The technology was on the block. It hasn't just been invented since COVID-19, but we've been forced to adapt. And sometimes I think you perhaps do need that shock that sort of make you adapt. Certainly, I mean, it's rather minor sort of point about what the IEA is doing, but we've completely changed the way we communicate and educate. And none of the tools that we're using, like Zoom or YouTube, have suddenly sprung into existence since the end of March. It's just the shock has obliged us to use them. So
well, maybe there was a coordination question, right? Maybe you hadn't installed Zoom earlier.
No, that's true. I mean, there is a coordination, that's true. But I think the cost of installing Zoom, in fact, the computer I'm speaking to you from now didn't have Zoom installed on it. I installed Zoom on this computer at 6:15 this evening. It took me all of 40 seconds. So it wasn't as if there were sort of colossal barriers to any of us achieving this. It's just that there wasn't sufficient pressure or shock or a dislocation to shake us into changing our habits. And I think that there's a good case can be made that sometimes, even though everything's there, we at the IEA could have been using Zoom, you at the Marshall Society could have been using Zoom for many, many months, or Skype or some other platform. The shock is required to actually adapt. However, all of that said, I'm not sure that we're necessarily going to move to this kind of nobody ever goes to the office again type society. And now we can all do our stuff on Zoom, and we've all worked out how to use it. I'd never heard of Zoom 6 months ago. Now half of my staff are experts on how every last feature on Zoom works. I'm not sure that the change will be as dramatic as some are predicting. Actually, I think although early doors, people were sort of saying, oh, this is all fantastic. I mean, although we're all in lockdown and scattered to the four corners of the kingdom, we can still hold meetings and board meetings. But I think there's probably a certain degree of Zoom fatigue and a desire to actually be in close physical proximity to your co-workers. So yes, there will be change. I think Zoom will be an ongoing part of many companies' lives, where it was a tiny little company only a few months ago. Probably it's the company that's grown the most in stock value over the course of the crisis, I think. somebody told me, I don't know if it's true, that the Zoom website is zoom.us, because when they were established, they didn't have sufficient funds to buy zoom.com, give you an idea of how far they've come. So these new ways of working that we've discovered, companies will become permanently in different ways. And I don't think that we should go as far as to sort of say that vast swathes of offices are all going to just shut down because nobody needs to be there. Why don't we just convert them all into flats? Maybe some of that. But I think we're going to revert to a working environment, which is probably 2/3 of the way back to February 2020, and maybe 1/3 augmented by what we've learned during the crisis and how we've had to adapt to lockdown and a lack of physical proximity.
Given the speed and magnitude of the government response globally, do you think that shows that Keynesianism is now the norm? And is there is that therefore a bit of a blow to the IEA's agenda?
Yes and yes, to be frank with you. Keynesianism, I mean, certainly across Western Europe and in the UK, if by Keynesianism you mean governments reaching for the lever of heavy spending, heavy and high spending to solve problems, that has become the new norm. I think it's a bit harsh on Keynes to call it Keynesianism, actually. I think that he might well be spinning in his grave to see his surname used in vain, because the sort of Keynesian view or approach was, and I simplify, of course, during the good times you run surpluses, and therefore during the bad times you run a deficit. Look, even a sort of free market, sort of Austrian-leaning economist such as myself, I think even I would accept over the sort of incident that we've just experienced in the second quarter of 2020, you'd expect government spending to go up. You'd expect the government to run a deficit. There's a danger that we have got into a habit of running small deficits when times are good and colossal deficits when times are bad. And that isn't over the long term sustainable. I mean, I'm not predicting financial or fiscal Armageddon anytime immediately, but we had barely repaired the public finances. In fact, we hadn't really repaired the public finances. We haven't completed that since the 2008 financial crash. It took 10 years to just about get back to balanced budget. Didn't quite make it there. And then the next crisis hits. And if we're going to have an approach to fiscal policy, which is every 10 years the public finances take an utter battering because of some unpredicted event, be that a banking crisis, be that a pandemic, but I guess you can expect, bad stuff to happen once in a while, whatever it is. If we're going to say, well, that's when we're going to spend colossally, but then it's going to take us 10 years to begin to get public finances back to normal, well, then we are storing up an unsustainable problem where the public finances cannot be stretched like this indefinitely and forever. As I say, I'm not expecting the British government to have to default anytime soon. If this is going to be our approach over a generation, then we really do have a problem. And I think that we have some systemic issues to deal with as well. I'm less worried about whatever it's going to be, a £300 billion deficit to deal with a one-off crisis, which you could see as an almost sort of war effort, if you like, than I am about the underlying problems in the public finances, colossal public liabilities we've got on the balance sheets. I mean, a very good example of that is I think that the crisis has exposed the idiocy and the unfairness and the non-viability of the triple lock on state pensions. The idea being your state pension goes up by 2%, or by inflation, or by real wage growth, whichever is the largest. So in 2020, let's say that will be 2%. Let's assume inflation will be less than 2% for the sake of argument, whilst wages are perhaps going to fall 20%. Next year, when wages one might presume will bounce back. So next year we might get wage growth of 20%, simply offsetting the 20% loss this year. That will gear the pension going up 20% next year. So over the course of 2 years, you get a 22% tick up in the state pension, even though overall wages have remained flat. So that's an example of where we've geared into the system a ratchet effect on more and more spending. So from the IEA's point of view, we lean towards favouring free market, small state solutions. We think that tax cuts are better than government spending programmes in the main. This is most decidedly a non-benign environment. I mean, I don't think anybody can say with any degree of sincerity or integrity that we are living in a neoliberal world. We are not. We are living in a very, very social, democratic and Keynesian world.
What taxes would you cut if not government spending? Then would you rather cut the VAT? Would you change depreciation laws? What would you do?
That's a good point, and I've probably got a. I'm not theological on a list of which taxes should go first. I mean, I think stamp duty is probably one of the most pernicious and distortive taxes. So the principles, so that would probably be quite high on the chopping block. The principles I would go for are to reduce or remove taxes which have the most distorting effects. Stamp duty is a very good example of that. But at least as crucially, I was going to say more crucially, at least as importantly, I favour radically simplifying the tax code. The tax system is, in my view now, in disrepute, particularly in the UK. I've lost count of the total number of pages in the tax code. I think that it's something like 14,000, and the word count is about 12 times the length of War and Peace. There are endless loopholes and carve-outs. Management is now a major profession and industry in its own right. This is farcical. So I would like to have the challenge of let's get the tax rulebook down from 14,000 pages to 14 pages. Well, that might be a bit ambitious, but you pick the direction of travel. So I would go for flatter, simpler taxes. And although I can see what Rishi Sunak was attempting to do with the sort of VAT reductions yesterday of, well, let's lower it to 5% on hospitality, although nobody 24 hours later has told me exactly how you define hospitality. I'm about to renew my season ticket for my football club. I don't know if that's a hospitality thing and now only 5% VAT or whether that's 20% VAT. But although I got sympathy with what he was sort of trying to do, I can see where he's approaching it from. He's again made it more complicated. So I'm slightly avoiding your question about whether I would go for VAT or corporation tax or income tax. Probably employers' NICs might be a good place to start, to go back to what I was saying earlier about making it easier for people to pick up displaced people in the labour market. I guess lower the cost of hiring labour might be a sensible response to this crisis if you're expecting 4 or 5 million people to be thrown out of work. But what I would really like to go for is a simplification. So with VAT, for example, I would much rather cut the rate to 15% than to have all these fiddly, well, let's reduce the rate to 5% on food and let's reduce the rate to 5% on drinks, but not alcoholic drinks. And hospitality, so I don't, if you go to the theatre and have a gin and tonic, is that hospitality? It gets incredibly fiddly and complicated. And the system can then be gamed quite seriously. So I think it's far, far better to sort of say, for sake of argument, we'll scrap employers' national insurance contributions across the board, rather than saying, if you take on X number of workers between 16 and 24, you can offset that against some corporation tax. There's a danger that every intervention becomes fiddlier, and it would be a great productivity gain, I actually think, in the UK, to simplify taxes, quite apart from lowering them. I see those as two different challenges. And oftentimes it's put to people like me, well, what do you want to lower? And there's a lot of, nearly every tax I want to lower. I feel as passionately about simplifying them. So if you said you can't reduce the tax burden by a single cent, Mark, I would still have a lot of tax reform that I think could do a very, very good job by simply making the system considerably simpler. Because at the moment, I think it causes a lot of gaming. You lose tax morale, basically. I think we're in danger. I mean, that's more a rule of law point. But because there's so many carve-outs and loopholes in the system, everybody thinks that everybody else is cheating the system, so they don't think they're entitled to cheat the system. A simpler rule book, 14 pages my target, but if you guys told me you could get it onto 140 pages, I'd settle for that. But 14,000 pages, and again, added to by Chancellor Sunak yesterday, that's insanity.
I think if we move away from budget deficits, we can only do that by cutting government spending, or do you think we will need to raise taxes to reduce the impact of cutting government spending?
I think I'm not a complete purist on this. I don't, the easy, soft default answer for a free market liberal like me is say, no, all of it's got to be done by reducing government spending. I don't think I'll go quite that far. I don't think necessarily all of it needs to be done by government spending, but by reducing government spending. But the vast majority of the heavy lifting, I'm afraid, is going to have to be on that side of the ledger. And the reason I say that is that the present tax burden is pretty much the highest it's been in 50 years as a proportion of GDP. About 38, 39% of GDP, something of that magnitude is being brought in tax. And intriguingly, if you look at the UK economy over, let's say, the last 50 or so years, no government has ever really succeeded in squeezing more than about 38 or 39% of GDP out of the economy. And that includes sort of governments of all stripes. That includes, I'm going back to the early 60s here, this includes virtually every mix of tax policy you could imagine. I mean, over that period of time, we've had a top rate of income tax of 83%. We've had a top rate of income tax of 40%. We've had all sorts of different rates of VAT. Virtually any tax package you can imagine has been tried at some point since the 1960s within the window of feasibility. And yet, try as they might, and most governments, with the exception probably of Mrs. Thatcher's government, most governments have tried to maximise government revenues. 38 or 39% seems to be pretty much as high as you can squeeze out of the economy. I don't rule out that there might be some wizard scheme to get it to 40%, perhaps even 41%, but you're not going to be able to get it much higher than that. And so if we accept that the empirical evidence suggests that the maximum tax revenue is 38%, something like that, and I'm not very comfortable with it being considered desirable for the government to squeeze out every last penny it possibly can, but if we say that is the maximum, well, in very, very crude terms, state spending's got to settle at that sort of level of GDP. Okay, you can run budget deficits if you're confident that there will be growth in the economy, of course you can. And governments do have other modest means of income other than tax receipts. You could sell off government land or something, privatise some assets. But in very rough and ready terms, 38% is the maximum that you can bring in tax, whatever tax package you try. And if you've got very substantial liabilities on the books, and we have got very substantial liabilities on the books, I mean, if we want to honour the public sector pensions commitments we've made, that's already a major commitment. I mean, the official national debt is only a rather small proportion of the total liabilities that we have. If the UK government was a private company or insurance business, it would have to list its liabilities. It can just list its cash deficit. So I think that we are more or less taxed to the max. Don't rule out that you might find some other way of gearing up tax by a whisker, but pretty much we're on the peak of the Laffer curve that each and every tax we're on. I mean, it's a sweeping generalisation, but I think ratcheting up taxes, some wizard wheeze to put the top rate of income tax up to 60% or something, probably wouldn't increase your revenues. So the heavy lifting is going to have to be done, and the real thinking is going to have to be done on the spending side. What spending do we consider to be high priority, middle priority, and low priority? Because that's where that's really, I think, where, like it or not, it's not really a question of politics, it's a question of mathematics, I think. Those are the decisions that are going to have to be taken in due course. You can run a massive budget deficit this year if you want, and we will, but in due course we cannot continue to spend the proportion of GDP we are spending if you want the UK's public finances to be remotely sustainable over the long term. If you want to go down the path that Greece has gone down, well, you can choose to do so, but I would heavily advise against following that sort of strategy.
We're going to open the discussion to questions from the chat. But before that, you just mentioned Greece. So how do you think that Corona will affect the EU, the Eurozone, its integrity? And also on that note, do you think Brexit had a good timing? Would it have been better to postpone it, do it earlier, or is it good that they are both happening at the same time?
Yeah, good questions. Listen, on the EU, I genuinely don't know. And it's quite interesting, I think, what's happened is that I think it's fair to say that in the eyes of many, the EU has been found wanting, right? It's the EU has not produced a particularly well thought through, strategic, coordinated response to the crisis. It's also been, I think, found to have had limited credibility. There's an element of the emperor has no clothes. You know, I was told that the absolute sacrosanct principle of the EU was freedom of movement. Well, as soon as you've got a pandemic, that has to end, and it has ended. So the EU, I think, has been shown to be, if you like, rather less important than some people imagined it might have been. But that, might be in its own interests. That doesn't mean it will collapse. It just might mean that we, Europeans, I mean, it would be a moot point for Britain before long, that EU citizens come to accept, perhaps even welcome, that national governments are where the real power lies, and whilst they might see that there's an advantage to have a European level of governance, that level of governance isn't and can't deal with the major events and challenges of our day. I've got no doubt the EU itself will reach the conclusion that it would have been enormously more effective during the whole coronavirus pandemic if only it had yet more powers, because that seems to be its answer to everything. Your second point about Brexit and has it come at a bad time? Yes, I think is the honest answer for that. I mean, I was a Brexiteer on balance. I mean, I think there were good reasons to vote Remain. I don't think the people who voted Remain were insane at all. I could see strong cases to vote Remain, but I was a Leaver on balance. And yeah, it is true. I think that it would be somewhat easier to extract yourself from a series of complex institutional arrangements if you were doing so during peacetime rather than in the midst of an economic downturn. However, I don't derive from that the smart thing to do would have been, I don't know, to extend the transition period by a year or delay our departure or reopen the whole question of whether we should be a member of the EU or not. And I don't say that for any economic reasons, I say that for political reasons, basically. I think that the procrastination in carrying out the 2016 referendum result was having an extraordinarily corrosive impact on our democracy. Had it appeared to the wider British public as a whole that everybody was acting in good faith and we were definitely going to leave the European Union and all sides were agreed on that and we're going to respect the 2016 referendum, in those circumstances, I think you might have been able to get away with saying, can we just put it back a year to get over this COVID-19 thing? But there've been so many delays, what appears to many, I'm not saying that they necessarily were this, but what appeared to, I think, to a lot of people, a large proportion of the electorate, to be somewhat dubious tactics, cloaked as safeguarding the British Constitution, but in reality efforts to frustrate our exit from the European Union. But although these are not the ideal circumstances in which to proceed, I think a failure to proceed at this point, whilst there might be some good economic grounds for buying a bit more time, I think the political damage to our democratic institutions would be pretty disastrous. And although I'm supposed to think in economic terms, if I was to make that trade-off, I think the best thing we can do is to bite the bullet, get on with it and get out. And we've probably have shown and learned something from COVID-19 about how to deal with complex supply chains in difficult circumstances, right? If we can keep supply chains running through the pandemic, which by and large we've been quite successful at, I don't think leaving the European single market is going to be the catastrophic shock to the system and the economy that many people have predicted. That's not to say it won't be without its difficulties. It will have difficulties, but I think those can be overcome. And if we don't get on with it now, I'm not going to make any hysterical predictions that there'll be civil war or riots in the street. There won't be, but there will be, I think, a continuing move from a disgruntled electorate to an angry electorate. And successful countries don't like angry electorates.
Thank you. So I think we'll go to a question from the chat. We had one about the EU actually, but I think you've already answered that very well. We've got one about pre-existing trends in the economy and whether you think there have been any major trends which have been unaffected or even reversed. And I suppose that also links to a question I have about, is there any reason for optimism and any way in which our economy is going to come out better than before?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the sort of long-term trends, no. I mean, I don't think there is anything that we can yet say is going to have been radically transformed. It might be we can look back in 4 or 5 years' time and see trends that have altered. You know, we've mentioned teleworking. I mean, maybe there will be more dramatic shifts in our working lives than we can predict at the moment. But I think the jury's out on a lot of those. What I would say about the long-term trends is the unfortunate reality of us dealing with this pandemic, which I've alluded to previously, is that it has hit us at a time where we have hardly been particularly robust. I mean, our public finances have not been in a great state for the last 10 years. Long-term growth, very poor. Productivity growth, dismal. And these are not the sort of long-term trends you want for when something buffets you in some disaster or problem or emergency hits. It makes it that much harder to deal with. I'm very fond of Warren Buffett's famous phrase, where he says, when the tide goes out, you get to see who's swimming naked. And the UK is a little bit like that. You know, you can sort of, as long as the tide doesn't go out, we're fine. But we have been overspending, overtaxing, productivity has been dismal, economic growth has been disappointing, probably on a long-term trend of about 1.5%, about half what would have been the case when I was your age. So all of those underlying problems need to be tackled, or the strain on reducing public expenditure is going to have to be that much greater. Causes for optimism. Yeah, I do have one. And it's that age-old catchphrase of never let a crisis go to waste. And a little bit like I was saying on the micro level, that perhaps you need a shock to the system in order for your company to start adopting newer technologies, which you just sort of left on the shelf because you could. And now you've learned that actually this improves productivity. That's happened on a micro level. Perhaps on a macro level, this will open up the space and the opportunity for more radical policies and reforms than would have been the case if the COVID-19 pandemic hadn't hit. I mean, I don't want to go so far as to say that it's good to have had the pandemic. Clearly not. One would have preferred not to have had it. But it might be out of that we do get that the very dark cloud does have some silver lining. So planning reform looks like it is going to move ahead. I mean, the UK has some of the most unbelievably restrictive planning laws. And I'm not sure there would have been the push to do much about that, or as much about it, if there hadn't been this necessity. So I think radical ideas from all directions, from free market directions, from socialist directions, any direction, are now, if you like, on the table in a way that they might not have been if we had not had this crisis. And although there's risks associated with that, I think that's actually quite exciting. The window of possible opportunities and future sort of policy directions is now much wider than it was. That could turn out horribly, but I think it's pretty exciting.
Maybe a short question, maybe yes/no question on the planning law. Would you abolish the green belt in London?
Yeah, I would. Just to be clear about that, every time I say that, people assume that because I want to concrete over the entirety of Hyde Park or something. I would replace the green belt with. I would be open to suggestions that there should be some preservation for areas of outstanding historical value or beauty, right? I don't think you should be able to bulldoze over Stonehenge and put a Tesco's on it, for example. But overwhelmingly, the green belt isn't like that. Overwhelmingly, although we think of these beautiful chocolate pots, sort of rolling hills and everything, most of the green belt is pretty grim land, actually. So if you think there's certain land that needs to be preserved or protected, okay, put it in that designation. But we are in danger of saying no blade of grass must die in vain. And we have doubled the size of the green belt since 1980, I believe I'm right in saying. And that is, in my view, the principal cause of colossal housing prices, and not just housing prices. I mean, it makes property, whether they're used for commercial or domestic reasons, just obscenely expensive. So you asked for a yes or no answer. Sorry, that was a verbose one, but the short answer would be yes. But I hope I've given you some clarifications as to what the rationale is behind that.
Okay, another question from the chat. How do you suggest the policy response to the pandemic be committed and sustained through all future governments? So I suppose that's saying about what do you expect the long-term strategy of the government to be? What should it be?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the real problem here is I'm not sure I can detect a strategy at the moment. There's lots of tactics, there's lots of crisis management, and I'm not necessarily blaming the government for that. I mean, in a crisis, you need to engage in crisis management. And they were having to make decisions on all sorts of things without perfect information. So I won't even blame them for getting a number of calls wrong. But I think I think there are two things that I would like to come out of this. I'm not optimistic about either of them. But if anybody was to ask for my opinion and listen to my voice, I think this is what I would say. Firstly, we've got to get serious on public spending. We are kicking the can down the road and pretending that we can forever live beyond our means. And you cannot forever live beyond our means. And we need to have a mature and serious debate about how we're going to split up the spending envelope. And we are not having that serious debate. We are involved in pretense and imaginary mathematics about spending money we do not have, quite often on things, in my view, that we do not need. So I would hope that we can actually, before a kind of Greek-style apocalypse hits, that we can have a serious argument about the nature of public spending, the scope of it, and what we really want to focus our public spending on. And we're miles away from a serious debate now. And the second, which I'm even more pessimistic about, what I would deeply hope we can have a proper discussion about, is the National Health Service. This is becoming ludicrous, the NHS as a national religion, and sort of North Korean style, sort of stand on your doorstep and clap your hands at 8 o'clock every Thursday. And, Joe Stalin style, the first person to stop clapping will be considered a sort of traitor to the nation. I mean, look, I'm not saying anything against the healthcare workers we've got, and particularly over this crisis, who expose themselves quite often to danger, and quite apart from that, have had to work extraordinarily hard. I mean, on them, I'm glad they're there. But we are absolutely blind and blinkered in our view that the National Health Service is the best system in the world. It just patently isn't. And if it was, you would have thought that other countries would copy and replicate it.
So could you have some ideas? Like one thing I find interesting is, for instance, Singapore makes you pay for every time you go to a doctor something like £10. Would you to discourage people from going to the doctor just to have a chat? Would you, for instance, like that idea, or do you have any other ideas?
Yeah, I think there's probably not one single healthcare system I can point to and say, let's just cut and paste that straight over. But the Singapore healthcare system seems to have a lot going for it. In broad health outcomes, it produces very similar health outcomes to the UK in terms of your likelihood of recovering from a stroke or recovering from cancer. It only costs half the amount, so they're getting a much better bang for their buck. If you wanted to look at the healthcare systems that appear to produce the best results in terms of the likelihood that you will recover from a treatable disease, and I think that is basically the fair result. You should never look at life expectancy. That's a different thing. Life expectancy can be affected by all sorts of things, like how dangerous the roads are and what the crime rate is. That's not a measure of necessarily your healthcare system. The measure is if you contract X, say breast cancer, or if you have a stroke, what is the chance that you will still be alive 6 months' time, 1 year's time, 5 years' time? And it looks like the German, the Dutch, and the Swiss systems are some of the standout examples in Europe. And it's basically a social insurance system. So I know everybody fears that if we were to reform the NHS, suddenly, we would be leaving people sort of bleeding on the side of the street unless they had a platinum Amex card on them. That doesn't happen anywhere else in Europe. I mean, in Europe, there's universal healthcare coverage across the board. Absolutely every European in the EU, I think, has guaranteed state cover. But because the state might guarantee your health insurance, so if you're a low earner, for example, the state might pay for your health insurance, or if you're a modest earner, perhaps halves and halves, you'd have to pay some part of the precept, but the government would step in and top you up. Once you've got that insurance package, it's not obvious to me that the NHS has showed that state provision of healthcare is an efficient way of actually delivering healthcare. It's a monolithic, rather inflexible, fairly inefficient state monopoly supplier, and that doesn't tend to end well. So in the German system, and in Europe in general, they're not hung up on whether medicine is provided privately or through which provider. It might be that it's funded publicly, or that it's guaranteed, you're guaranteed access to it. But a bit like, I would say I'd liken it to it being our intention in Britain that everybody has access to food. So you have either welfare payments or you could have food stamps for poorer people. But that doesn't mean the government needs to run the supermarkets. And I think the government's efforts to actually run the healthcare system, not merely guarantee access to it, which is what they seek to do in the rest of Europe, is producing historically very, very bad numbers for National Health Service. It's not terrible at everything, but it's a relegation candidate, not a Champions League contender compared to the rest of Europe. And although the jury is still out, and I wouldn't want to leap to conclusions, it seems to me that the data that's beginning to drip in suggests that the British system has not coped with this crisis at all well. There may be other explanations, not just the healthcare system, but the number of deaths in Germany is a very small percentage compared to Britain. Now, that might be explained away about different lockdown laws or density of populations, or how they organise their care homes or whatever else. I'm not saying you can pin it exclusively and entirely on the healthcare system, but I think it's reasonable once the numbers are in for us to have a searching argument about, do we really believe the NHS system is the best way of providing healthcare in the 2020s? And I think that the actual evidence is it isn't. And we would be far better to go down the sort of route that Singapore or Germany or the Netherlands or Switzerland has adopted.
Thank you very much. I think we'll finish on one final question, a bit of a fun question. Which economist, dead or alive, would you put in charge of the UK's economic recovery, and why?
That's a good one. Well, it's almost certainly going to be somebody dead. All of the best people are dead, and I'm not feeling too well myself. Who would I put in charge? I think probably, and actually, you're saying economist. I'll tell you who I'm going to go for. Actually, I was going to go for something very grand like Friedrich Hayek or Ludwig von Mises, but I think I would actually go for a civil servant who I think does actually count as an economist. He was a very well-read economist called John Cowperthwaite. Cowperthwaite was the financial secretary to Hong Kong after World War II. And he, I believe, can claim more credit than anybody else. Oftentimes, victory has many fathers and defeat is an orphan. I'm not suggesting it's all his credit, but his approach to running the Hong Kong economy, I think, is the underpinning and the fundamental reason why, although it's obviously got very serious difficulties with China at the moment, it's been a colossal success story from 1945 onwards. Go back to 1945, GDP per capita in Hong Kong was about the same as an average African country. Forward wind to 2020, GDP per capita in Hong Kong is substantially higher than it is in the UK. Why? Because Cowperthwaite was marshalled Hong Kong's resources very well and ensured there was not high spending, state intervention and central planning. And his genius at doing that and his steadfastness in trying to hold back the tide of all these government plans put Hong Kong on the road from, I wouldn't say from ruins, but from on the road of relative poverty to colossal success. If we could resurrect John Cowperthwaite and put him in charge of the British economy, only good things would happen over the next 10, 20 or 30 years.
This also resonates with your claim that we need to simplify the tax system, because I think that Hong Kong has something like a 20% flat rate tax on everything.
Yeah. Keep it simple, keep it low, and try and keep in most areas government out.
Now, Now, George, you said it was the last question, but I'm really tempted to ask another one.
Go ahead.
So we're obviously still students, and I was going to ask, what implications do you think Corona has for the university sector, and whether the state should bail out universities or just let them default, and whether we will see a rise in platforms like Udemy and Coursera permanently, and whether, say, Cambridge will decrease in importance.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually Oxbridge is, and possibly the Russell Group, are in probably pretty good shape, actually, because the brand, the reputation, the status of Cambridge University is so colossally high that it will never want for very bright, determined students who want to go there. I think that I can't foresee anything in the area of technology or anything else that will over the long term imperil the likes of Cambridge, Oxford, and probably some of the other top universities. But longer term, I think the university sector is surely going to shift and change. And of course, the Open University was launched by Harold Wilson way back in the day. But it does seem to me now, if I was to rewind back to the dark ages when, sorry, I went to the other place. I'm an Oxford man, admitting that at the end of this event. But I was there 1990 to 1993. And you could sort of see, because technology was very different at the time. I mean, it was considered absolutely a massive breakthrough that a friend of mine had an Amstrad. I mean, everybody else was, writing longhand script pretty much with a quill pen almost. Nobody had computers, printers, email didn't exist. Nobody had a mobile phone. Material online. You went to the library and got out a hard copy book, and you could see in that environment why you needed to be physically together and why you needed to get out of bed and go to a lecture hall and listen to some lecturer deliver for the 116th time his particular lecture on France under de Gaulle. Technology now really, I think, unwinds that. I mean, can you not do the bulk of the university course wholly online from anywhere where you sit in the world? I appreciate a large part of the university experience isn't just the learning part, it's the camaraderie, it's the extracurricular activities, it's running societies, all of that's quite important. But I wonder whether that might be done in a rather different way. I think that the idea that education in the future will necessarily involve, for a vast swathe of people, leaving home, going away for 3 years, living in student digs, being surrounded by 10 or 15,000 other young people in the similar buildings and grinding your way through a degree and then entering the labour market. I think that might change. Probably not at Cambridge or Oxford, possibly not at the Russell Group, but I think there will be many more ways to study, learn, and to get qualifications that don't require you to pay £9,000 a year for a bricks and mortar experience and a huge amount of rent, heat, electricity, and no doubt beer bills as well. So I think big change is coming, but not imminently.
Great. Then thank you very much. And it's a shame that Will Hutton didn't join us. And with this, we'd definitely welcome all of you back in Cambridge next term. George, do you want to add anything?
No, I was just going to say thank you. That was amazing, Mark. Very fascinating discussion. Shame you couldn't be with us in Cambridge, but I'm sure we'd love to invite you in the future. Thank you very much.
Come down and see you soon. Although I'm an Oxford man, Cambridge is a much more beautiful city than Oxford. So do invite me to a bricks and mortar event when those become possible. It's been a real pleasure to spend the time with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you.